trying to get the background on this thing. How do you set the background?
This is the first episode of Keep Listening, a podcast built around open conversations with people from all walks of life.
Or is it just the way it is?
There is a way.
To make it blurry in the background, you mean?
Yeah.
This episode was recorded on November 20th, 2025, and looks back at the early years of APTN, the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network.
Did you, Jim, if you move the cursor around the middle of your screen, you should get a little icon of a microphone and a camera.
What you're about to hear is a reunion of the people who helped build the network in its earliest days.
Okay, camera.
I was honored to be joined by Jim Compton, the program director.
Oh, so one is a mic and one is a camera.
Jennifer David, Director of Communications.
Hello.
Hello, Jennifer.
Dan David, News Director. So we're waiting on Dan. And Terry Rudden, a consultant and a friend to everyone involved.
Can you hear me okay, Steve?
These were the first to hold these roles at a network unlike any other in the world.
You're not recording video on this, are you, Steve? It's just a podcast, right?
That's correct. We talked about origins, obstacles, and what it takes to build something that matters. You guys want to just jump right into it? Jim was my boss at the time, and I was one of 2 development program officers.
Sure, absolutely.
Sure.
So, when is the last time everybody's actually been in the room to actually talk about APTN and go over the history of their experience of living in it? Jim, have you been? You and Terry, when's the last time you guys and even with Jennifer, when's the last time you guys actually have gotten together?
Getting together, I remember we had board meetings, and I think I could be wrong, but I think the board meeting was in Montreal, and they were discussing not so much our fate, but how to deal with us. That's what I remember. It was one of those kind of discussions. That's the last time I remember. Terry, do you remember that?
I don't physically in the same room face to face. It's been ages. I do remember we had a couple of conversations where we exchanged a guy goes into a bar joke, many as we could remember in a short string. But that actually sitting down and chatting about stuff. No, it's been forever.
Yeah, no, I don't recall either, honestly. I mean, I got to interview you all for the book, but I don't remember us in a room or sitting together. Those of us in Ottawa used to meet quite regularly, but that's been years since we've done that.
It could have been Montreal. It could have been Iqaluit. I know that, for example, when we met in Iqaluit, that's when we were bringing on the woman from Saskatchewan as our communications director.
Yes, exactly, because I was not at the Montreal meeting.
Yeah, and you were introducing her, and
that's right.
I remember it. They had the
Deborah Piapot. That was her name.
Right.
Deborah Piapot. Yes. And that
pull that out of the attic of my memory.
So that was early in the early days, I think.
Yeah. That would have been 2000. Yep.
And Terry was there. Patty was there. Yourself, myself. So that would be the 4 of us. Yeah.
Wow.
I remember Dan was there and stepped off the plane wearing a Hawaiian shirt, obviously forgetting that Iqaluit is a cold place. Yeah, you can defend your decision there, Dan.
What decision?
Your decision to fly to Iqaluit in a Hawaiian shirt.
Of course.
Doesn't everybody?
So
yeah, he's there.
So the question I just posed to everybody before we got started was to ask when was the last time everybody who's around the table at the moment has actually had a chance to talk about their early experiences.
Well, we were just giving some context there, Dan. We thought it was Montreal, but I think it was Iqaluit when we were all there. We all went north, and Jennifer was introducing Deborah Piapot as the communications director, and I think that was early in the APTN history, right? So, and then you got off the plane with a Hawaiian shirt, according to Terry. So.
Yeah, but I don't think we ever sat around and talked about what happened at the beginning as a group.
No, never.
So this is great.
This would be a first.
So Jennifer's only with us for about 30 minutes, so I thought that the best place to start would be to start with Jennifer's book on the early days of APTN, the launching of the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. Jennifer, I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, how difficult was it to get the research to do the work that you did? And I know that Terry was involved as well. I could imagine that he had some input in terms of the early days of TVNC. Can you get into the television Northern Canada, because we can't talk about APTN unless we actually talk about TVNC.
Yes, that's very true. Well, it actually wasn't that difficult. Yes, it had been about 10 years since the launch, but of course I was there. So, I mean, I still was remembering, I knew all the people, I knew where they all were. And I remember getting some support from APTN to write the book. And I showed up in Winnipeg early on to do the research. And I went into the basement in the office in Winnipeg, and all of the boxes of the minutes and the documents from when I was there were still sealed in the boxes that I had put together and taped up all those years before. So I just opened them up and started going through them, and everything kind of came back to me at that time. And it's true, I was only part of TVNC from 1995. And so I relied on Terry, who was, of course, the editor of the book as well, to sort of fill in some of the gaps and tell me who I should speak to in terms of early days of TVNC. But of course, in the early days of APTN, the members of APTN were the TVNC members. So again, I knew most of them. So I wouldn't say the research was difficult.
Terry, if you pick up on Jennifer's points about the early parts of TVNC and how they were a big part of APTN, and really we can't have that, again, to repeat my point, we can't have that conversation about APTN without TVNC.
To be honest, I wasn't that big a part of TVNC as an organization. I had been a training director and an HR person for the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation when they started off their operations in the early 80s. They were one of the original TVNC founding groups, and they said as a strategic goal when the organization was first incorporated that they were going to try and get a consortium of people together to develop a national network. And the reason behind it, the rationale was, in the early days, none of the Aboriginal broadcasters funded under the federal government's Department of Heritage program, the original founding members of TVNC for the most part, none of them had distribution. They all had to negotiate distribution for their programming, and they usually did that with CBC. So what that meant in terms of the one group that I worked for, IBC, was that at CBC Northern Service would give them a window to put on their children's programming. It didn't work very well. I can't really see that parents were going and waking up their kids and saying, come and sit in front of the TV set at half an hour past midnight so you can watch this children's programming in Inuktitut. So the issue was really distribution, and the different players from the northern provinces and the territories got together and formed this coalition to lobby for a network. And it was like a small, high-speed version of what happened with APTN. A group of people came together, saw a need, applied for a license, and got it. And that was the origin of TVNC. Once you had a TVNC, which provided, I don't know, Jennifer, you would remember that better than me. How much programming did they actually put on air back in the day?
Wow, I don't remember, but I know there were a dozen broadcasters that had shows, and then the legislature in the NWT was also being broadcast on TVNC. But it wasn't a conventional network like we understand networks now. As you said, Terry, it was a satellite distribution system. All these Indigenous broadcasters from the north had somewhere to put their programming. So it was very collaborative in the sense of they all together decided, which time slots they got. So it's not like a typical network. It was just so they didn't have to put their shows, like you say, kids shows on midnight on CBC North.
I was just going to say, once you had an organization and an infrastructure and a system for exchanging information, jointly scheduling and all that kind of stuff, once that was there, the obvious next step was to take it national. And that was where that movement, the northern-based, federally funded programming material, all in native languages, that was where that movement began to run into some of the exciting film projects and broadcast projects that were happening in the South. And that was where suddenly two worlds, they didn't collide, they coincided, they coalesced. There was a big need and a big interest on the Southern side as well from the independents like Jim and Jim's circle of folks. So what was your perception, Jim? I'm just asking as a conversation. What was your perception of that early close encounter?
Maybe I'll just tell you how I became involved with TVNC. You know, as producers, we were trying to get stories told through CBC, through some of the networks. And of course, we hit that proverbial brick wall, right? So I knew about TVNC because I was on the Royal Commission, and I traveled north to Yellowknife, and I took great interest in their infrastructure, you know, so their server, everything that was happening, how it worked, you know, it was basically a northern network with a schedule, and you know, I didn't really know how they did it from a satellite system, but they had a distribution mechanism, right? So we heard rumblings because. I mean, I don't know how deep you want to get into it, but I know that the communication societies, which are basically northern, and some of them had a bleed into the south. They were programming things. So, long story short, is George Henry was the head of TVNC at the time, or maybe he was.
He was the chair of the board. He was chair of the board.
Okay, there you go. Thank you very much. Yeah, but he was connected to the communication societies as well. So there was.
And NBY in the Yukon, yes.
Yeah, Jeff Bear was part of it. So this thrust started creating a program that could be triggered through the broadcasting system to do documentaries. So we hired George Henry to be our consultant and trigger those documentaries that we're looking at that would run on TVNC, but they would not run in the South. And so that's how I twigged onto that. And then I also twigged onto the idea that they were going to launch a network. And at the same time, I had been working on it myself with a few people in the South through what is it? It's not IRTC.
Manitoba,
CRTC.
Oh, sorry,
No,
I thought
CRTC.
you meant the Manitoba.
So CRTC, I met the head of not the head, but the rep from Manitoba, and he gave me access to the CRTC applications. One was was the Women's Network, and so what I did is I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to write something up. So I wrote up an executive summary with the idea that we would start one in the South. You know, based on the northern perspective. And so I had written that up, and I had presented it to the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs because we were doing that documentary that was triggered by TVNC in Vancouver. And at Vancouver, we put forth a resolution to start a Southern network. And so then, you know, as we were following Phil Fontaine, it's called Making of a Leader, you know, Phil Fontaine, how he became the national chief. We were filming in Quebec City, and then I get this panic call from Terry Giberson.
Yes.
Terry was the one of the architects of the network, right? Yeah,
he was the director of network operations for TVNC.
There you go. Thank you. So he calls me. He says, "Look, we got to talk. I want to meet you in a bar." And so I went to the bar and I met him. And sitting beside him is Gary Farmer. Now, Gary Farmer was co-opted by, I shouldn't say co-opted, but working with the TVNC on the network, right? So that
he was part of a Southern advisory group. We set up this Southern advisory group. He was one of them.
And I you know, the funny thing about that is I did meet Gary Farmer in Albuquerque, in August. And you know, we talked about it. He says, "Well, you know, I was the architect of the license. I wrote the license." And I said, "Yes, Gary, but remember when we sat in that meeting in Quebec City, I said that license did not reflect Southern producers. And we needed that clause added into that application, because what they would get from me was that I would pull my Southern application and support their Northern application as a national organization. That was sort of the argument. And, it would be able to be voted on in Quebec City. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been voted on. It would have been dormant. So I said, absolutely, but let's change the wording of the in the CRTC application to reflect Southern producers. I said I do not want them to have to go cap in hand to the north to get their licenses, right? And so Jerry agreed, Gary agreed, and I believe Abe Tagalic agreed, because he was the executive director of the time for TVNC. He took over from George Henry, because George Henry quit, and then Abe was the head.
Yeah, that's
anyway,
right. He was
so
chair.
that's sort of the Coles notes of how I became involved.
Yeah, I remember when I was talking with you, Jim, and when I was writing the book, I didn't realize that was quite a pivotal time. It really could have gone in any different direction, but because we pulled, or you pulled, that AFN resolution, and we ended up jointly doing a resolution, and that got passed by the AFN, that gave us some very significant clout and support for the notion of a national TV network. And so that turned out to be way more pivotal.
And then they added me to the Southern Advisory Committee, along with Alanis,
Roman Bittman.
Roman Bittman, but the guy that did the Inspire Awards, John Kimball.
Yeah,
so
I don't think he ever came to any
also,
meeting.
So all these Southern people were there, and they were all supporting it. And
That's right.
It was good for the application, because when we went to CRTC,
that's right.
We were all on board. It was like, we're united, we're one, let's move forward.
Yes.
Jennifer, if I could just jump in, your book really highlighted the work of George Henry. Can we talk about George and what a bulldog he was for Indigenous media? Because if there's a takeaway I did take from your book, I have a number of new heroes in the Indigenous media world, and your portrayal of George is somebody that I didn't know his backstory. I didn't know the work he put into it, but you really made him into a hero in my eyes.
Interesting, because to be honest, it was difficult to write about George Henry. So, I mean, rest his soul, because he's passed away now. But he was not easy to work for. He was, you said bulldog. I would actually say bully as well. And again, here I am. I mean, like my early 20s. He's the chair of the board, and he was very intimidating. And I mean, I understand it now. I mean, 20, 30 years later, I can see that when people have addiction issues, how they come out and how they're seen in the world, sometimes you get the brunt of what they're dealing with. And I, being the youngest employee, unfortunately got some of the brunt of that. However, it doesn't take anything away from the work that he did. But I do think that at some points, and all the TVNC board members would agree with this, that George had this way of taking things so far and then essentially self-sabotaging himself and whatever initiative he was in. So I really do believe he was the right person for the time that we needed to build this vision for this national network, but he was not the person to take it across the finish line. And because Abe, as I say in the book, was more of a collaborator, sort of a peacemaker, somebody who could have support in all the different sort of camps and areas. He was the right person to get us. I don't think we would have had the network if George was there through the whole thing. So I think they both played pivotal roles, and he absolutely sort of inspired people. And people said it couldn't be done, and George is just like, we're going to get it done anyways. Like, he's very bold. But sometimes, as you know, when you work with people who have bold visions, there's things that fall by the wayside on the way to doing that. So I do appreciate that you noticed that about George. And I can tell you that when I was interviewing Catherine McQuarrie, who ran NNBY in the Yukon when George was there back in the day, and she was friends with George because they went to journalism school together. I actually asked Catherine, so here's a little behind the scenes from writing the book. I asked Catherine to basically tell me some of these things about George because I didn't want to get sued and I didn't want to say them in my book myself. So Catherine agreed to sort of talk about some of those prickly aspects of his nature as from her perspective of what she sees of him. So we kind of got around, having to say some of those things. And I mean, that's a very sort of Indigenous way too, like strength space. Like I didn't want to air dirty laundry and, talk about all those negative things, but he was definitely a difficult person to work for. The good thing about it is it was like my very first boss, although Jerry Garberson was my boss. George Henry as the chair was really kind of my first boss, and it was very difficult. So seriously, in the last 25 years, it can only go up from there. Everybody since then, it's been a piece of cake. But maybe that's also why I started my own consulting company, so I could just be my own boss, so I wouldn't have to have any more bosses.
What I took away from it was just how he was viewing the situation in terms of the lack of financing and a need to do something just a little different. And it seemed to me that he kind of had to get past those who said it couldn't get done. And he said, no, this is the way it has to be. And it seems to me that we can even still make a case that this guy was fighting for Indigenous independence all the way through.
Yeah, no, I agree. And remember, he was a lawyer, right? So he knew the CRTC inside and out, and he took every opportunity there was. Let's put an application in for that. Let's make sure we get our voice in there. Let's do this. Let's do that. So absolutely, for sure, I do agree. And he always had that bigger sort of vision, like dream bigger, right? And so bring people along.
Yeah, so from that, I could see why he would probably butt heads with people who just couldn't see it, who couldn't see the vision. Jim, did you work with George? What was your impressions of George?
Well, as I said, I did not have a great working relationship with him. He was the consultant that got us involved with Television Northern Canada through documentaries. I think we did 2 documentaries through him, and he had the mechanism to trigger telefilm. Because that was the key is license from a network to trigger, and it's the same notion that we use for APTN. Same thing, but with APTN, because it came south, we were allowed to grow the contributions that APTN and now CMF are putting forth. Yeah.
If we could go back to the era in which you guys were living, Jim and Dan, and you were as Indigenous filmmakers or Indigenous, people wanting to work in the media industry, what were the obstacles that existed back then that most people couldn't imagine? Because now APTN's been around for over 25 years now. Our representation on, over the air is right there for everybody to see. But back in the day, you couldn't actually, seldom did you ever see a documentary on Indigenous issues. So I could almost see where George was living in terms of, and both of you guys were both living in that era where you just didn't see any Indigenous representation on TV. So I could see where I would be, if I'm in George's shoes, I would be cynical. I would be, I probably would have acted like a bully and said, hey, we need this, we need that. It was non-existent back then.
I worked up in CBC Whitehorse, and George Henry was over at NNBY. And one of the things that I realized right off the bat was that there were 2 worlds in Whitehorse. Everybody kept talking about this village called Kwanlin-Dun. And you'd see these people coming into the studio in 3-piece suits. They were lawyers, they were politicians, they were business people. But I never saw anybody from the village itself come around and be interviewed about talking about life and what life was like in the Yukon, in Kwanlin-Dun, which was a village actually within the limits of Whitehorse itself. So I kept asking, where is this village? Because I couldn't see it. I'd walk around, I'd go here and there, and I'd come back and keep wondering, where the hell is this village, Kwanlin Dun? Finally, somebody said, you go behind the big storage tanks in the industrial end of town, and eventually you're going to come across Kwanlin Dun. So I started walking down that road, and there was this old shanty town, basically, barracks built by the people, the U.S. Armed Forces, while they were building the Alaska Highway. And there were bare-ass kids running around, broken bottles, beer bottles. There were cardboard in the windows. In other words, this place was a cesspool. It was a ghetto. And yet, you kept hearing lawyers and educated people come in for interviews at the CBC studio and not reflecting that reality. They kept talking about policies and other kinds of highfalutin things, but not the reality of most of the people, not just in Kwanlin Dun, but in the Yukon. And so that was my first experience as a journalist working on Indigenous affairs, about the two solitudes that existed with us and everybody else in Canada.
Were you drawing inspiration from what you were seeing up there?
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, hell yeah. I mean, you had to, because it hit you like right across the forehead with a 2x4. This is wrong. What we're doing as journalists is pretending and giving the impression to the listeners, the viewing, listening audiences out there, that this is what Canada is like, ignoring the cesspools of our reality out there. So I said, we have to do something different. We have to begin to talk about that other reality, explain it, not just talk about it like we're, a bunch of specimens under glass, under examination, like social scientists, but really to explain the impact of that in a human way, in an empathetic way, to make people understand that this was just plain wrong. This was not Canada.
Ultimately, that is the goal of APTN, is to kind of sway the opinion of how people see Indigenous people, I would imagine.
But you also had another thing. You had another effect too. And, one of the things that I noticed at that time, I took a quick survey about who was Indigenous in Southern newsrooms. I'm talking about radio, television, public, private, newspapers, magazines, everything. And I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of people like Brian Miracle, who was at the Globe and Mail, and Bernelda Wheeler at CBC Radio, and others like that. But otherwise, we were the few working in Southern journalism. It was just, basically, we weren't there. We didn't exist.
Yeah. And even in TV, I remembered when I interviewed Fred Cattrall, and he was our photographer. He joked, he said, the only Indian I remember on TV growing up was the test signal with the Indian in the headdress that they used to put on the screen, right? So we've come a long way, right, since there, but it just wasn't seen. Or if they were seen, they were in token roles, or they were in productions where there were only Indigenous actors, like think Dance Me Outside, right? Written in this very colonial, writer, producer, director, but had a couple of Indigenous actors. Like, we're way beyond that now, but that was all we had to choose from. That's pretty much all we had to choose from when we launched APTN. It's kind of cringeworthy now, but it just shows you that we weren't just building a network, we were building an entire production community.
Well, we don't have you for much longer, Jen, so I just want to actually get to the other part of your book, which is actually the launching of the network and the day of. And if I could just summarize the day and some of the humor about it by this one particular quote that had me laughing, to be quite honest, when I read it, is that, "Dad, are they trying to kill us because we're Indians?" And I was, and that story focuses on the fireworks that kind of went sideways, literally, at the end of the evening. So look, can you tell us about the second part of your book, and that's the day of, what that meant to be part of that day, and everything that you wrote about spoke of chaos, yet there's unity and all that as well, right?
Yes. Well, what's kind of amazing, right? And this is like 25 years later. I mean, I was young. I wasn't even 30 years old. So, unlike the stories that Dan's telling about what it was like to actually work, in an industry where you couldn't see anyone, I didn't, I think, realize how monumental it was until after the launch and, after I had gone. So it was kind of good that it was like 10 years later that I wrote the book, because I could really think back and say, this was such a pivotal time, and you don't realize how important it is while you're in it, because you're really just seeing, you got to get this done. It's got to go on air. I was the director of comms, so I had to be careful in what we said, and because there was still a lot of opposition. And so we had to make sure we put on the best face out there and that everybody was curious, but, are we just going to be tokens again? So we worked really hard. But I mean, it is amusing when you think about it now. We were kind of crazy. I mean, the whole idea was crazy, starting from George Henry's, bold idea. And then not only do we want to launch a national television network, but it's going to be on basic cable, which means everybody's going to get it. And we're going to charge a subscriber fee. We wanted both. We wanted our cake and we wanted to eat it too. The CRTC gave us everything we asked for. And then we knew we were going to launch September 1st. We had 6 months to get an entire network up and running. And then we decided, on top of all that, let alone start broadcasting on September 1st, let's have a 3-hour live television production and show with no money, and hire somebody who's basically going to go find the money, put on the show, get the whole, everybody together and launch a network at the same time. It was crazy, crazy, crazy to think what we did, but it was very exciting. And this whole fiasco with the fireworks was just, it was almost unbelievable that this happened. It was so grateful that nobody got hurt, but everybody knows that story now. If anybody was at the launch, that's what everybody remembers. It's the fireworks, right? And we all joked about, well, wow, that is a way to start a network with a bang, right?
I'll dispute that nobody got hurt. One CBC reporter, Joanna Awa, had a tiny spot on her hair singed off.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right.
She took it in good spirit and laughed her head off. I remember coming downstairs the morning afterwards, and there had been of course, everybody's racing down to the lobby of the hotel to grab a newspaper and see what they're going to say about the show, what they're going to say about the launch.
Me, of course.
Of course. There was a huge fire burning out of control in BC that same day. And so when I walked up to the lobby to grab the paper, the first thing I saw was this photograph of flames. And I thought, Jesus, they're choosing they're choosing the fireworks story to lead the whole coverage. Fortunately, it wasn't. And the reviews were good.
Yeah, it's true.
I have a question for Jennifer, if you don't mind, Steve. So if you were to write that book, and I know they talked about it, because when they had the 25th, they interviewed me, and they said they were talking to you about writing a book too. So would there be anything that you would add to that book?
In fact, I did get an Indigenous publisher, Thetis Books, to reprint the book, because their first edition was self-published, but I got Thetis Books to republish it, and you can now find a new version of the APTN book, 25th anniversary version. And the one thing that I added, I mean, the story is the same, but I added there's a new foreword and a new afterword. And what I say in the foreword, or maybe it was in the afterword, essentially, we now have this language of truth and reconciliation. And I essentially said, before we had that language, TVNC and APTN is the perfect epitome of what reconciliation should be. And I said we were doing it before anybody was even talking about it. But this idea of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, North and South, coming together because it was the right thing to do to launch this network. And we did whatever it took with everybody's skills and passion to make it happen. There was I was approached to ask if I would write a book book about the first 10 years of APTN, but because I wasn't there, I left after a year. I just felt that wasn't my story to tell. And if you'd have asked me, Steve, like if I had done that book, how much research, it would have taken a lot more research. I just feel like I felt kind of called to write the book because I was there. I was a witness to it. I have a communications background, so I knew I could, but I don't think I was the person to write the first 10 years. But somebody should, because boy, oh boy, all the stories I've heard about the craziness, and you were there too, Steve, right? You should write that book because that was also a crazy time.
I have my own stories, and we'll get into them hopefully in this podcast. Jen, how much more time do we have for you? Because I have a couple
I do have to go, but I'm happy to answer one more question. Then I have to go. I'm sorry.
Well, let's just talk about the book. How long did it take you to write the book and so forth?
Yeah, so it was published, I think, in 2012, and I think I started it maybe, I don't know, Terry, you might know, because you encouraged me from the very beginning. Maybe took 2 years, maybe 3 years, but at the time I had 2 young kids, so that was the thing that was taking it even longer. I think they were, not even less than 10 years old. So it was a very busy time, and, full-time job, young kids, and trying to write a book in my sort of spare time. The interviewing is the thing that always takes the longest. Like you got to find the people, find a time, interview them, then go through all the notes, and then go through all the secondary research, and then go through all the minutes from all the meetings and figure out the chronology. Because, it had been 10 years. So, my memory was pretty good, but still there were things I didn't know. And then all the stories from other people's perspectives. That was so fascinating. So I think it was between 2 and 3 years it took.
One thing that I would add to that is, and I'm going to throw this to Dan, is a chapter on the news. The history of it.
Yeah, right, for sure. So great conversation, guys. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to stay longer.
That is a question for you, Dan, by the way.
Yeah, and I'll leave Dan to answer it, but I'm sorry I have to take off. Steve, if you want to do more just with me and then plug it into your podcast, that's fine. Get in touch with me. I'm happy to chat more. I could talk about this stuff all day.
We'll do this again. How's that sound?
Thank you. Okay, everybody, take care. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Jen.
So I'll leave you that question, though, Dan. It was a very interesting question, is that she left in 2000. The news department was just getting going at that particular time, and the hirings was starting to take place. While the programming department at APTN, we were able to kind of borrow off their schedule and slot in their programs into our time slots and our schedule. The news kind of was just blank. It was a blank slate, and you inherited nothing as far as I could see. So there was nothing that we could put into the time slot for news. So you were coming in with basically nothing at all. And I'll tell you what the book kind of highlighted for me in terms of the news was, and this is a big part that I didn't know of, was that you were steadfast in identifying the culture that needed to be created for the news department, more than just, hey, let's hire some people. Because from what I understood, you were looking more for, hey, what are we going to represent in terms of news? How are we going to gather it, and how are we going to tell it? More as opposed to, hey, let's just hire somebody to go up there and just read off a teleprompter. Can you talk about that challenge in terms of developing the news from a clean slate, developing a culture, and then trying to identify who you're going to hire to tell those stories?
Well, first of all, I think you got to back up, because you said there was nothing there to work with. There was a lot there to work with, but it wasn't at APTN, not at the beginning. I got involved with Aboriginal communication societies, James Bay Communication Society, Wawate, and others, as a trainer, working at CBC, but going up north and working with those people on news programs, radio news, and in the case of Wawate, with some television. We all believed in the beginning that we needed to have some kind of network built, a network of news, of journalism, real journalism, not just a whole bunch of, current events kinds of things. Going back to 80, I remember a meeting that was taking place at some kind of a restaurant, I believe, called the Mayflower in Ottawa. And in the back, 12 or 14 Native communication societies represented. I remember Wawate was there, AMSA was there, a couple of others, and we all talked about the same thing at the time, that we needed to have some kind of network to create news. It didn't matter what it was. It could be a clearinghouse in Ottawa, based in Ottawa, where people would send in stories and then fax it back out to whoever it was. So from the Atlantic to BC, from the north to the south, that there would be that kind of communication, that kind of clearinghouse for news. They were talking about bicycling radio programs from northern Ontario out to the Atlantic provinces and vice versa. But how to make that work? And so they didn't have a central office, and they created something called the National Aboriginal Communications Society, and they hired Jeff Bear to run it. So Jeff Bear looked at me. I was freelancing around Ottawa at the time, and so I started working with him and then looking at ways that we could actually develop a national news network in one form or another. At the same time, I was doing a contract at AFN in communications. And all of a sudden, one of my former profs who was working there as well said, why don't we come up with an idea and pitch it to the CRTC about taking a little bit of subscription fees from the extension of service, satellite and cable, and put it towards producing or supporting Aboriginal communications, production of whatever, whether it was news or it was current affairs or drama, theater, whatever. And so that's what we did, and I actually delivered it to the CRTC. It went down like a lead balloon. Nobody really cared because what we were asking for was a minuscule amount, like something like 1/4 cent per subscriber. I suppose if we had asked for 5 cents per subscriber, we might have gotten some kind of attention. But, basically we asked for too little. But it was the idea that we needed to have that kind of support and recognition by the CRTC, that there was a hole that needed to be plugged in communications in this country and needed to be plugged by Aboriginal producers and journalists. So that's going back to the beginning. I don't think a lot of people know that was going on in Ottawa.
What year was that again, Dan?
That was early 80s, because I went up to Whitehorse in 80, 81, so it had to be 81, 82.
That's interesting, because essentially what I'm hearing is that you actually planted the seed to the CRTC to provide a subscription fee for the service that you were proposing, which is, 12 years later, if that's the case, in 92, is well, hang on a second. Let's just go back to, when did the application to the CRTC go for APTN's license? That would have been 92, was it? Jim, do you know offhand?
No, it was
97.
The application went, and Terry might correct me on this, but I do believe it was 1999.
That was when the actual launch happened, but the original application, carry on with the conversation, and I shall conduct my own personal
Read the
research.
book.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was in the late 90s. I do believe it was in the late 90s. I remember, for example, going to Banff for the first time and, meeting all the players of TVNC. And that was in 97. And, the minister was there. So everything kind of snowballed up until, we got the license in February of 1999.
Yep.
To go back to Dan's point, the point I was trying to make was that Dan and that group had basically planted the idea of that subscription service to the CRTC 15 years earlier or something along those lines. So, that vision originated earlier than I thought, is the ultimate point I'm trying to make here.
Well, it wasn't by any one person. It was, something that as a group of Aboriginal communicators, we had to, deal with, we had to consider. So it was a great idea, and we just pushed it forward, whether it was through NACS or it was through the AFN. So, I didn't come up with the idea. We came up with the idea.
Terry, you were a consultant on the book. Can you tell us about your role on Jennifer's book and so forth?
Sure. I mean, my role on Jennifer's book was I was her editor. So she did all of the heavy lifting, and I changed some of the semicolons to colons and added a few commas because I really like commas. But it was her book and her vision. In terms of TVNC, well, I had been working for the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation at the time, and they were one of the drivers of the notion of developing an expanded production system. Because of all of the contributors to TVNC, they had the heaviest obligation in terms of their funding. They had to create 5.5 hours of programming per week, and they just had nowhere to put it except the tail end of the CBC stuff. So what was it? It was a loose affiliation with a board of directors represented, and the directors were the heads of the groups funded by the Northern Native Broadcast Access Program of Secretary of State, which was television producing groups right across the territories and in the northern portions of the province, like Welwate. And although it was originally distribution, it really led to a lot of formulation of co-productions, networking among the different players, and a solid network for doing things like planning distribution, preparing a schedule, the actual technical management of tapes in transit, because it was all tapes then. Nobody was, there was no digital way to transfer material. And that, I think, is what represented probably the biggest piece of the APTN Foundation was, this thing really could work with a highly decentralized distribution and production system. Organizations with very different focuses and styles and goals. And they developed a really, really, really strong following, to the point, in fact, that APTN is still viewed in some communities as a kind of takeover. It says, those guys took our network and turned it into this national behemoth, which was, the right thing to do, and certainly made possible a whole new level of really, really, really important production and social change. But there's still folks who miss the old network. So that was TVNC. It was very regional, all native language, except for, I think, a couple of organizations whose primary language of programming in their own region was English. And just a good network of people. It was sort of the foundation of the goodwill that helped APTN get off the ground. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, I also remember something called the Therrien Commission. And they established a line that said, you're north and we're going to support you, and you're south and we're not going to support you. You're going to have to be self-sufficient. So that killed a lot of Aboriginal communications across southern Canada. And so, for instance, Kainai News out in southern Alberta, Micmac News, and Maliseet News, and others, some of them, just withered on the vine because they suddenly lost that kind of federal government support. But that also, I think, was a driving impetus to create Television Northern Canada, because they continued to have federal support while the rest of southern Canada didn't. And I think it was done rather stupidly, looking at the survivability of languages. And they identified 3 languages, I believe Cree, Inuit, and I can't remember the other one. But it was it was some ludicrous policy decision made by that commission. And it came in at the same time that they were doing the extension of service to satellite and cable across northern Canada to improve communications, get the CBC, for example, and get Detroit television into a color TV. That was bizarre.
There were a whole bunch.
It was a racist. I think it was a racist policy to have the Hamlin line being the determination of who gets what. But I think that it all goes back to 1982. When the Broadcasting Act allowed for them to and called for them to have representation. That's where it came from. And so you had, the way I look at it, there was two wheels cogs moving, the one in the north and one in the south. And what happened was when those wheels came together, meshed together, that's how they created APTN, because it included all those issues that Dan was speaking about having our news available to not only us but Canada, all across Canada. So that's what happened there, and so it was a racist policy, but it was corrected, I think, by the CRTC when they created APTN and allowed for that news to come south and be north, and then also for programming to be reflected north-south, and triggering some of the anachronisms I can't remember, but CMF.
If you look at the broadcast line for broadcast funding, you'll see the Hamlin line has a very strange little dip in it, which they refer to as the modified Hamlin line. And it was modified in an office at Secretary of State, where they said, well, we can't leave out Wawate. Wawate is like one of the biggest and the best of the broadcasters. So we'll just, it's kind of like Donald Trump editing hurricane maps with a magic marker. Here's the new Hamlin line. Oh, look, Wawate's in it. Phew, thank God. Just one other
That's
tiny.
Interesting. I never knew that.
It's true. One other tiny footnote, just when you mentioned the 1982 Broadcasting Act, just to a tip of the hat to George Henry again. And I meant to throw this in when we were talking about how hard he was to work with. Well, he was hard to work with, but it was partly because he was a bulldog. And the getting a modification to the existing Broadcasting Act that actually asserted and recognized the right of Indigenous broadcasters, peoples, and audiences to programming in their language. He fought for that. There's that famous picture of him sitting with Flora MacDonald and Rosemary Kaptana, both holding the signed copy. That was their work, and that was largely to his credit, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you have to be a bully to get things done in some ways. If you're going to navigate your way through some of these political circles, you kind of have to be that way, I think. Dan, Dan, I didn't know about the Southern Societies. This is news to me. What was the, were they producing content in terms of television, or was it just news?
Community radio, community newspapers, a couple of magazines. It was a pretty active and vibrant Aboriginal journalism community out there, until they suddenly created this line and cut off the funding, and all of a sudden a lot of these organizations and publications withered on the vine. They just couldn't get the advertising or community support to continue. They died.
Were you part of that, Jim? Were you involved in any of that?
Well, this was in 1980, I think, because I started at CBC. I started at CBC in 1982. So, just when the act was coming out. But what they realized is that they had to have some kind of BIPOC representation in newsrooms across the South, right? So that includes Winnipeg, Regina, Ottawa, and Dan was stationed in Regina. I was in Winnipeg, and I applied for that job just before I was on my way going north to NCI in Thompson, because I needed a job, I needed work, I needed pay for things, but that program came about, and Ron Nadeau had given me a letter of reference to work at the CBC. And anyway, so long story short is that's where I started at CBC. They recognized that there was inequities, and that's where it started for me.
Jim, you always told us, I remember some of the meetings we used to go to, and where we'd be in a room full of non-Indigenous media types. And you told this story one time about when you were employed at the CBC and a reporter in Winnipeg. During the broadcast in which you were part of, the ratings were higher. And then when you left the network, the ratings went down. And I guess the point that you were trying to make was that it does actually pay to the viewership and the ratings to actually have Indigenous people in the forefront. Because basically what you're saying is that you're drawing from an audience that wouldn't tune in otherwise. tell me about
That's
that story.
It's in my new book coming out, the memoirs of Jim Compton, and I'm not kidding. I am writing my memoirs. But yeah, on that, I mean, again, the catalyst was that program, but also there was government funding that paid for my salary, which also came from something called the Core Area Initiative. So the Core Area Initiative was a program that was set up in Winnipeg because we had the largest Native population in the country, and Native issues that nobody really cared or knew about. So I was hired based on the fact that I went into CBC and they said, "So why should we hire you?" And I said, "Well, I can bring you the Native community, and anything you want to know about Natives, I can answer." And that's how I started there. But what happened was there was a push back, and they wouldn't put me they ignored my stories, and they wouldn't put me on air. And I was writing the memoir, and I was thinking about, well, what was the catalyst for me? There was a fellow that was hired from Northern Ireland. His name was Peter Werner, and he was coming in from the war-torn streets of Belfast, and so he was looking for social impact stories. And so I had pitched this story many times about how the Indigenous people of Winnipeg and all of Manitoba were affected by sniffing solvents, and how it was hurting the people. They were ending up in hospitals. They were, and the retailers would not take anything off the shelves. They didn't care that the Indigenous people, for the most part, were involved in sniffing solvents. So I pitched this to him, and he said, "This is a great story. How come we're not doing it?" And I said, "Nobody wants it." So, here I am, and I wasn't even a writer broadcaster then. I was just a trainee. We went out, we filmed it. I had all my contacts. Ended up being a 2-part series. It aired, and it was a phenomenal hit, and the ratings actually went up. And I think part of it was the fact that they didn't know that Natives could tell stories, and they really didn't know what was happening in their own streets, and why we were ending up in ending up with all the social ills filling the jails and everything else. So that's what took off, and that was in 1983. And I left CBC after doing a 2-part, 2-hour primetime special, national special called Drums, which looked at the issues of the time in 1992, including Oka. Dan's family was a big part of that. The ratings were at the top. And then I left to go to the Royal Commission, and that's where I twigged onto TVNC and creating our own network. So yeah, the ratings did go up, and there was a lot of journalists that followed my footsteps, Colleen Rajat, Rick Rate, to name a few, that were brought on later to do those stories. So I'm very proud of that. That's in the book. I'm going to get Terry to proofread it for me.
Well, he
Do I
likes
get
his
a
comments.
free copy?
Oh yes,
It's a deal.
Let me tell you my Jim
I don't think
Compton
they'll
story.
sell that many, but I just think that the accomplishments that all of us have put into this industry, they need to be told. And for those of the people that want to read them, fine. For those that don't, I think I told my brother, I said, "You should write a book." He says, "Well, who am I going to write it for?" And I said, "Well, write it for yourself, because this is what will help heal you, because that's where the healing comes from, when you remember those, and why you do journalism, why you do documentaries, is because of all the experience that you've gone through in your life that got you there. And you have to, the old saying is, you may not get over it, but you got to go through it, and by going through it, you're healed." So that's what
Dan, you want to add to the CBC element?
Yeah, I was on something called the Visible Minorities Program, and we were supposed to bring the color to your evening television news programs. So I was part of a group of 8, 3 blacks, 3 Chinese, or Asian people, I should say, and 1 brown person, and of course me. I was the only Indigenous person on the group. I think they had something like 1,000 applicants, and they chose us. And then they inflicted us out in the regions right across the country. And one of the people who wound up in Winnipeg was a woman by the name of Claire Prato. She had this gorgeous afro. She was from the Caribbean, and a lovely woman, really nice. She was a documentary filmmaker before, this program, and she became a documentary filmmaker afterwards. But anyway, she called up one day and she says, because we stayed in touch, tried to support each other because it was pretty fucking lonely out there in those newsrooms. And she says, there's this guy. You got to meet him. You should come over to Winnipeg and meet him. The guy's name is Jim Compton. He's got these braids, these great big long braids, and he comes in the morning and he starts braiding his hair at the desk. And he wears these shirts, and they're colorful and patterned. They look like Western Indigenous kinds of style. And anyways, CBC won't let him go on the air. And I said, well, what do you mean they won't let him go on the air? They won't let him go on the air because he's too Indian. He looks too Indian. And there are people there who came to me, she says. She says they came to me and they said, Claire, can you talk to Jim? Can you ask him, please, to cut those braids and maybe dress differently? And she says, I looked at them in shock and horror because what are you going to ask me to do? Bleach my skin? Cut my hair? Straighten out my curls? And she was just livid. And she said, no, you go do it. If you have the guts to come to me, you go and tell Jim that he's got to cut his braids. So that was my introduction to what was going on over in Winnipeg. But stories like that were going on with people of color right across the country in various newsrooms. Like, I can't tell you how many times I was told to my face by people, and so were others who were working as black and brown and Asian journalists, you don't belong here. I remember one editor for Radio Canada coming up to me in the radio building in Toronto, blocking my way out because I was leaving. I had my coffee, heading back to the office, and he stopped me and he blocked my way and he says, you don't belong here. You shouldn't be working here. You shouldn't be a journalist. And I said, why? Because you're Mohawk, because you're an Indian, and there was that attitude among a lot of people at places like the CBC, and it shocked the hell out of me because I thought, we're journalists, we're educated, we are, somewhat more liberal, but, these are the kinds of things that we all had to overcome to get some kind of equity at the CBC. And I bet you beans for dollars that every newsroom, whether it was radio or print magazines, was the same thing all over.
When I hear sometimes, Jim, you talk about your journalistic style, you sometimes refer to, I learned a CBC way of telling stories. I've heard you say that in the past. What is the CBC way of telling stories?
Well, and that might be a better question for Dan because, Dan was part of the training that was, I wouldn't say, it was part of the training that was assisting us in telling our stories. Dan, what was the head of training there at CBC, the English guy?
Tim Knight.
Tim Knight, yes. So we got the Tim Knight training every so often, which was great training, and I think that his training was a lot more in depth and more about telling people stories rather than news stories. But that was good. But there was also always the editors would take your stuff and they would say, okay, well, this maybe not balanced enough. That you have to have more of the other side. And I said, well, my thought at the time, and maybe it was wrong, and as a journalist, maybe I shouldn't have moved forward with that. But what I said is there's two parts of the stories. I says it's their side, this side, and the truth. And I said, that my stories will reflect the truth based on my perspective, because I am representing, and I did feel that when I was at CBC, I felt that I was representing my people, and I wanted to get it right a lot more than any of the other journalists who were not Indigenous, right? So that was part of it. I mean, when I first got to CBC, for example, I mean, they had this unit called the I team, was the investigative team, and it was made of all these white producers and reporters, writer broadcasters is what they call them. And there was this one show that they were heralding as this is how we're going to sell the newsroom and everything else. And it was a story about following white cops going into the most repressed parts of Indigenous Winnipeg, and how they arrest and deal with Indigenous people on a nightly basis, and they asked me, well, what do you think about this, because I was just new, and I said it's fucking gratuitous violence is what it is. There's no other side. It doesn't tell the story of the people, and why we are here. I mean, the history part of it, and again, thank goodness for Tim Knight and Dan that that history part of it needs to be in there. Otherwise, it's just well, yeah, there's the Native people, they're drunks, they're bad, and so what? So there was no redeeming qualities to do it, so that was the difference, I think. And I think that, when every time I would, as I got a little stronger in the CBC, I was able to bring that forth, so last story I did when I left CBC was, the Northern Flood Agreement, which affected and flooded 5 different Cree communities in the north that were never consulted. This is way back in the 70s, and how they had been fighting and why they were fighting for so long to get the right compensation reconciliation, right? And that gave you the backstory. So, and this turned out to be, it was kind of unheard of on CBC to do a series. This is a 5-part series. And we looked at the history of it, boom, boom, like all the way along. And this is why, these people are banging on the doors of the legislature trying to get compensation for the people that have been, had this inflicted upon them in the early 70s. So that's sort of what I was talking about when this is how we need to tell stories. And those are the stories that we need to do on APTN.
The reason I asked is because your styles were influenced by the CBC, and I take it you brought those styles with you to APTN. So, and my question is, how did those styles find themselves within APTN, or were you able to separate yourself from those styles and adopt new ways of doing things because you had your own network? And that's kind of why I was asking that question. And it's really more of a how-to kind of question. How did you do it? What was did they have a specific structure? How do you develop your journalistic principles? And how are they influenced by the CBC?
Well, I think the question is, how did we influence the CBC? I think, and I'd love to hear Dan's perspective on that as well.
I think I was telling Terry yesterday, we talked briefly, or was it the day before? I was discussing what we were trying to do at the CBC, with employment equity, trying to hire people who were not mainstream, who weren't male and pale, who, were bringing stories out of our different communities. And it didn't work. We never got to reach something called critical mass, where you could actually have enough people of color, including Indigenous peoples, to be able to affect the editorial direction, whether it was news or current affairs or even drama. We just never had enough people out there. And so part of my hope at APTN, part of my master plan or whatever, was basically to have people come through APTN, learn how to do journalism that was based on empathy as opposed to just simply, objectivity and neutrality, where you didn't care for the people that you were covering. With APTN, you should care for the people that you're going to be telling stories about, that you're going to be covering, because not just that you're part of their communities, but because it's bringing out that humanity to the rest of the audiences around. So anyways, there wasn't going to be any kind of critical mass. So what we had to do was bring people through, learn that, be able to internalize that sense of journalism or production, and then infect other places, other production houses, other newsrooms at CBC, at CTV, at Global, and begin to infect them with this idea that there is a different way of doing journalism, just simply, treating people like objects to be covered as opposed to people to be understood.
That was the challenge that I saw in the book, that I, go back to Jennifer's book, is that you were put the task to create a 1 hour news show once, and you were only given, 6 months to do it?
Well, during my job interview, I laid out a plan to have a national news network. And I think that's one of the reasons why Abraham and Gail, I think Morrell, hired me in the first place, was I had a game plan that talked about a national news network with bureaus in different parts of the country, feeding a central newsroom, and then broadcasting the news across. We didn't have any people. We didn't have any equipment. We had no facilities. When I walked into the Winnipeg place, there were cables hanging from the roof. There were people with jackhammers. We didn't have desks. We had no computers. We had no studio. We had nothing. So that was their problem. My problem was the people. Looking for a group of people, a core group of people who believed in something, had a cause, as opposed to a job. And so I looked around for people who wanted to change the world, change the narrative that was, predominant in Canadian society, that had us as, perpetual victims of society, to be pitied and taken care of, or as perpetual problems that just wouldn't go the fuck away. They just wanted us to disappear. So to change that narrative, you had to have people who understood that aim, that objective, and made it part of their own personal style in journalism. So, it was through the training. Yes, you learn the basics, how to write, how to edit, how to shoot, and how to comport yourself as a reporter. But it was really, trying to get people to understand a vision for changing Canadian society.
Do you remember who your first hire was?
Ken Williams.
That's right.
I met him at a party in Toronto. We were both drunk as hell. And I talked to him. And I said, Ken, I'd really like to talk to you about working at APTN. I just got this job. And we have no news. We have no program. We don't have anybody. I'm the only person working there in news right now. But I'd really like you to come on board, because I had read his stuff and I recognized somebody who was, first of all, a really good writer. Secondly, had a sense of visual style. He understood visual storytelling. He was independent. He was an independent thinker. He was really funny, had a great sense of humanity. He cared a lot about things. And so I walked up to him and I said, we're both drunk, and how would you like a job at APTN, working as a reporter for APTN News? And he said, okay. And that was it. He was the only person I ever hired without a hiring panel, without interviews, the first and last.
So when it came to hiring the on-air hosts and so forth, those.
Oh no, I was part of that as well. Yeah, I had recommendations, and Carol Adams was the person who I had worked against when I was working in Winnipeg, reporting for CBC. She worked across town working for the CTV affiliate out there. So we were competitors. I think we kicked their asses. But she was one of the few people who had on-air experience, and occasionally, sitting in as a fill-in host or anchor. So, it made it pretty obvious. The other thing that I didn't want to do, and I made a point of this when I was looking around for candidates and asking people to, at least apply for a job at APTN News, I was looking not to hire people who were the franchise. The one person who was so valuable at a place like Wawate, that you took that person out and the whole journalism would collapse. So I was very cognizant not to take away the best people. I was looking for people that you could bring in and that you could train, give them the best training available, and hopefully make them into a journalist, into a television journalist, which was a very specific set of skills and talents.
First of all, Carol Adams, I thought she was a fantastic on-air host. I thought she was perfect for the network in the early days. And so who was the co-host, by the way? She was just one, right? There was somebody else, if I remember correctly. Was Ken on air?
He was on air, but he was not. He wasn't a host. He wasn't a fill-in. I can't remember.
When it comes to what existed in 1982 and your efforts to try and bring...
Rick Hart was the co-host, I think. Sorry.
Was Rick Hart the co-host?
I think so. He was on air.
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
So my point is that there was a big drop-off in terms of potential talent that you could have drew from because of the cuts that happened in 82. It was almost like a lost generation there for about 15 years, it seems like. Although it sounds like CTV was hiring, CBC was hiring, but other than that, there really weren't very many communication societies out there that were really, how important is that whole, passing down of mentorships to the next generation and what it leaves, the void it leaves when you don't do that?
Well, you're building a culture, and that's what cultures are supposed to do. It's supposed to bring people in, assimilate them to that culture, and then continue on for the next generation, and so on and so forth. It'll change over time, and it has changed. APTN News is not the same as it was back then, and it shouldn't be. It had to evolve, and it has evolved.
So let's talk about that. What did you see in terms of the original diagrams of what you're creating to what it's now transformed into? Is there something along the lines of the types of stories you told, or are there more in terms of the on-air host? What exactly what are the changes you're seeing?
Well, first off, one of the things that we tried to do was let people know that they could tell stories. And so, they would do a 3 to 5 minute story, and, other people would go 3 or 5 minutes. Come on, give me a break. Everybody else is doing 1:30 or a minute long, and that's supposed to be television news. We didn't believe in the format. If there's a story and it's a good story, then let it run as long as it needs to be told properly. Tim Knight used to say something like, how long is the story? How long is a piece of string? It's however long that it needs to be. And that was the opening philosophy. I think that over time they've changed that over and become more and more like everybody else, format driven, short clips. I noticed that in the beginning it didn't matter if somebody went on for 15, 20 seconds in a clip to explain something in a story. I think that they now have gone down to the point where it's like maybe 1 or 2 seconds. And it's really hard to figure out how any human being can explain a complex situation in 1 or 2 seconds. So I think that they've adopted something, that the mainstream is doing, and it's the way that news is. I may not like it, I may not agree with it, but I don't run the show.
Critically speaking, the important thing that we kind of all acknowledge is that how important it is for Indigenous people's stories to get out there and make sure that they're authentic. The APTN News over the last 25 years has won numerous awards for their storytelling, and they've won CMF awards for best news anchor, I believe, if I'm correct on that. So it has come a long ways in terms of getting recognized by their peers. Do you think that the level of storytelling that you talk of and the in-depth analysis that's required to get into each of these stories, do you think that there's a bit of editorial influence perhaps that has maybe creeped into the equation that maybe wasn't there when you started? Do lawyers get involved into the storytelling of the news department and perhaps sway them not to dig deeper into the story because of that?
I think early on that was one of the big fights that we had, was trying to insulate the newsroom from outside interference. I remember, shielding the newsroom. You got a complaint, you talk to me. You don't go directly to Bruce or whoever else was in the newsroom. You talk to me. I remember once that there was a board meeting and there was somebody who was a good friend of the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations at the time. He wandered down into the newsroom and he began telling people there, I want you to do these stories, trying to direct them that he wanted them to do certain things. And I got this call upstairs. I marched downstairs and saw this was going on. I grabbed this person by the arm and said, come on, let's go out of here. And I told him, don't you ever, ever violate the sanctity of the newsroom ever again. And that's the word, and that's what I meant. The news should be a sacred place beyond that kind of political, outright, direct interference. You can make suggestions, you can complain all you want, I don't care, we'll look at it, but the news to me was something that was had to be sacred, had to be protected. So that was my job. My job was to provide them with the resources to be able to do their job and to protect them from those kinds of outside interferences.
When you think of TVNC, I wonder if, based off what you just said, whether that's actually possible in some of these smaller communication societies where you're if you're in Iqaluit and you're telling stories about a particular politician in that small environment, whether you'd be less inclined to go and actually tell the full breadth of the story based off the fact that you're likely going to see the person on a daily basis. Whereas if you're in the national network, that prospect doesn't exist as freely. So I wonder if the TVNC crowd would say, we just don't have that liberty based off the realities of our situation. I don't know if that's, I wonder if, did they produce news content like that?
This is exactly why we had to have those kinds of protections with APTN News, because they would stack, and this was the government funding policies at the time. You had to have somebody from the band council or from the tribal council sitting on your board of directors. So Wawate would have people from various communities who weren't communicators, weren't journalists, who didn't understand journalism or how the news operated or the purpose of it. And they would look at a story that was being produced, maybe hadn't been published yet, but they would look at it and they would hear about it, and they would kill the story, or they would fire the person. So these kinds of things happened. With IBC, I remember that there was actually a station, a community radio station, that they locked the doors to the station, prevented people from going into work, because one of the staff members used a word like kabluna, to one of the white managers during a meeting. And he didn't like it. And so he decided, well, I've been insulted. I'm going to lock them out of their job. So these kinds of interferences was happening all the time. They were violating the journalistic rights of journalists to do their jobs. And it didn't happen just in Inuit or just in Wawate. It happened right across the country. So that's why APTN News had to set standards that protected journalists. Whether or not TVNC, whether this was a common practice, what they did about it, maybe Jim knows better, but I didn't work with TVNC.
Jim, what did you experience? What was your experience in terms of, maybe even at the CBC? Did you have to water down your stories based off, pressures from above? Oh, can't hear you, Jim.
Look, I got to go. I should have gone a half hour ago. I got to hit the road.
Okay, Dan, listen, I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. It was important to have your messages in this, and I wish you well. When we recorded this conversation, I didn't know it would be the last time we would all share these memories. On January 12, 2026, Dan passed away after a long battle with cancer. He was 73. This is Keep Listening. Sorry, Jim, you still with us? Can't hear you, though. Harry, you're listening to this conversation. I think you're understating your role in all this. I always saw you as the super consultant that was always involved in different aspects of it. And I actually have something that actually you and I worked on together. Hang on, I'll show you in a second.
I know, I remember it.
This is the second draft of the Acquisitions and Licensing Policy Manual. And you and I actually were involved together in you sent this to my desk and you asked me for my input on it. I didn't keep many things from APTN, but I did keep this.
Oh, cool.
Do you remember being put to task to create this?
I do. I think my role in the early they called it. I'm trying to. The title was coordinator, which was about as vague as you can get, and I think I was there because I had worked a lot on TVNC and worked closely with most of the original NNBAP funded broadcasters. So they were a little bit leery of pretty much anybody who hadn't been part of that circle. And so I think part of the value that I brought to it was being able to be a liaison between these really, really, really strong, high profile, high power Southern filmmakers and broadcasters who that's how the APTN folks were largely perceived initially from the north. My God, these are real players. It was like sort of Peterborough looking at Hollywood. But the involvement in stuff like policy. I mean, one of the interesting things about APTN was that it actually did look at itself as an organization when this was being put together. Of course, the first thing you focus on is the high visibility stuff like programming and location and the technical setup. All of that is an obvious need. What was less obvious, I think, in the very early concepts was the boring questions of organization and management. So I think that was part of the role that I was brought into play, was actually because I had done that with many of the northern broadcasters, and so that's why I ended up with that. Oh, there he is. Are you audible?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, something just went wonky there. I don't know what it was. All of a sudden, it just went out. So sorry.
So Jim, we're just talking about so I was just bringing up to Terry that I have about a few things that I kept at APTN. I did keep this, which is the actual copy of the original, the acquisitions and programming licensing policy. Let's just stay with this because I think it's really critical for people who are out there to kind of understand the challenges of APTN. This seemed to be, if people are talking about the recipe for failure, I think some of it is found in this document, and specifically to the challenges that were put forward by the CRTC, or maybe just the scale of the challenge that we were putting forth in terms of we were going to represent all Indigenous people Therefore, it only meant that, by claiming that, it only meant that we were going to have a schedule that had a certain amount of languages on it. And that challenge is inherent in that. How do you maintain an audience from one show to the next? If they're 1 minute they're looking for Mohawk content, and the next minute they're listening to Inuit content and so forth. But all of that is kind of written into this manual, and how challenging it was. And yet, understand the realities of the situation in that you were, at the time, we were only getting 15 cents per cable subscriber. For those who are actually unaware, APTN is financed by cable subscribers, and at the outset of APTN in 1999, we were getting 15 cents per cable subscriber. I've always said in the past that this is a recipe for failure in so much as that it's just impossible to kind of retain an audience from one show to the next based off the fact that, you could never guarantee if French was going to be on, Mohawk was going to be on, or Mi'kmaq or Inuit. It just made it very complex to try and fund a financial business that would never had any guarantees of the from one show to the next.
I think it first of all, I didn't find it that challenging. Because then you got to go back in the history of APTN. So before you got there, Steve, I'm not sure if Terry was even there. He probably was. Yeah. So when we, as a Southern, as a board, as a advisory board, Southern Advisory Board was trying to plug into the Northern Board, which we found out a little later was basically the board, right? So there was 10 board members in the North. And then the Southern board members were advisory, and as we move forward, they remain so. And Terry can correct me on that. So that was the structure of it. But before we even launched, we met, and I remember this in Ottawa. We met, and we had a schedule, right? So the schedule was mapped out. And I was still an advisory board member. I wasn't even the program director. I was just an advisory board member, and it was all mapped out. So it was kind of like, okay, folks, here's what we're going to do, right, Terry? It was all mapped out, and it was based on their needs, TVNC, and fulfilling their mandate to their members, and then incorporating a Southern schedule, right? So, there would be some bleed into that, like, for example, children's programming. As we developed, it would plug in there, right? So early on, it was basically a TVNC model with pockets of programming that we bought through CBC or NFB or whatever is out there, right? So that's how it started, with the idea that we would create programming as we move forward. So that was laid out for us before we even got there. And so when I came on as program director, my thought and my direction was, let's start creating programming that we can plug into that schedule, and a lot of it would have to come from the South, because the South is not a lot of it, but balanced off, I would say, from the Southern producers as they came forward. And that was the thing. When we first launched, there was no Southern programming that was licensed from APTN, but there was an envelope, which is the one I twigged onto when I first worked with TVNC way back when. There was an envelope for Aboriginal broadcasting within Telefilm. I don't think it was even called CMF at the time. So that was our window, and this is what we had to trigger to move that idea forward. So we took proposals from the North and the South. What happened was the North really didn't have a dedicated pool of people to do that, because it was driven by the societies. They didn't have independent producers, I guess is what I'm trying to say. In the South, they did. So and so the telefilm was mainly driven by that, and I think IBC had and Terry knows this, had a special relationship within that they could trigger. All we had to do was to bolster that with an APTN license, right, for some of their programs.
Yeah.
So that's so it was laid out for us, and it, if you look at it, it was basically an accommodation license to, first of all, get the network started, but also to explore getting other producers to plug in, and some of the northern producers became independent producers. Like I know that, for example, Brenda Chambers, and you know this because we licensed some of her stuff. She did programming we licensed, and it was coming. I believe she was representing the North Yukon, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what it was is that the North did not have a dedicated, thriving, independent producers network as much as the South did, because the South had all those producers that had worked with the NFB, CBC, CTV, all those existing networks. There was a pool there, and that's sort of where we focused in on, right? Like, you put out a call, as we did for proposals, and as we got them, we made decisions based on that, right? So maybe that's where the inequities came in, with the North saying, well, you're not doing enough for the North. But I think that a lot of them came in through the news department, because the news department was working hand in hand with them to create those that programming for the newsrooms early on. As we move forward, it totally separated and became an entity unto itself. I think Dan David said it best. He said it evolved. And what I wanted to say when he was talking about the news is, when I went back there for the 25th anniversary, they invited me back. They interviewed me. The news department interviewed me, and we walked through, the old sections of APTN. But what struck me the most, and I thought, this is one of the major reasons why we started APTN, was the news. Because, I would look, they got an old bank building, and they took me up, and I overlooked all the people working on the news. It's a national network. And one of the visions I had when I was first, proposing a network was to have a Indigenous host, right? And I even dreamt about it. And lo and behold, we've had, right from Carol Adams on up, but to meet this young man who cut his chops at CTV, Creason Adjicate, as the host, and he was in a brand new, state-of-the-art news studio, surrounded by all these. And I said, this is a major part of the dream of APTN to get that started. Now, if you ask me about programming, I do have my druthers there. Mainly the fact that within that license and that creation, I do believe that we wanted to create pride in our people and our culture, and within that, you wanted to create stories that would reflect that. Well, we're the old guys, and what you got now is a young, up and coming producers who don't think about that, about all those people that have, blood, sweat, and tears for our rights. Number one, right? So, when we got that license, for example, the Métis supported us, but there's no Métis specific programming, and there never will, because it's not driven by those. It's not in the mind frame of those young people, and because you have even young producers, executive producers, programming people, they don't get that. And I think that's one of the druthers I have, is that they should not forget where they came from, because that's part of our culture and our history. And I think that's something that has to be reinvigorated into it from the people that are on that board, for example, right? Because, there's when I started there, we had one Métis program that I initiated. It's called La Voix de Métis, and they did 2 seasons. I have not seen another Métis show driven at all about history of the Métis, which I think is sad. And I think that those are some of the things that really need to be the historical part of it, of where we came from, has to be a major part of what we do as we move forward. And those young people are they're doing ghost shows and aliens and
Yeah.
cooking, but it doesn't reflect where we came from.
I'll even give you the story that I remember. So I came in. So I came in September of '99 at the Ottawa office. Went to Winnipeg, and I remember receiving some of the very first ratings for our shows, and some of the first. The highest rated show that I remember was a show by the NFB called Caesar Builds a Bark Canoe. And this particular show actually had no language in it at all. It was just an Atikamekw canoe maker who just was making a canoe. That was one of those little dynamics that always kind of struck me as odd. Is like sometimes the audience doesn't want to hear the language; they just want to see somebody actually making something. And that was clearly the case in this case. Now, mind you, that documentary had an audience that previously had seen the show, so they were seeing it for the first time on the national network. But I remember that as being a very curious kind of example of what the audience is expecting, what language it was broadcast in, and how does that actually fit into the meeting the requirements of our language requirements. So it was very tricky in so many different levels to try and commission a show or even acquire a show and know whether it was actually going to be a hit or not. And mind you, so really that in a lot of ways that actually speaks to the reason for being at APTN. I never really thought that we were really chasing numbers in terms of audience. I thought that we were kind of our reason for being was to tell stories, as Dan was as eloquently putting it. Let's just tell stories that need to be told, and let's just do that. I felt that was kind of at the end of it, that was our baseline, but it was very challenging to find these shows that were actually going to be hits. And I remember us always chasing that one show that would come in and say, look, we need a lost leader. We could get into the depths of the issues that we dealt with in the programming department. I remember us chasing a lost leader in the sense that what is going to bring us the maximum audience return, and how do we chase that? And I look, we could get into the stories of it all, but that was the dynamic always. Like, that show we think could generate more higher ratings, but we also knew that it was going to be costly, and not only that, it was going to be what language will it be? It was always a dynamic that was always on our minds.
I'm trying to think of an analogy that would explain it that way, but there isn't one. There isn't one. Basically, Steve, you, me, Clarence, and our 5 people in the programming department. We were basically the guinea pigs, I guess. To lack of a better term, to figure out how to do that. But so they wanted that, but they did not have a strategy to move that forward. So basically, it was left upon us to do our best to make that happen. And what I would say is that it has evolved, right? It has evolved. So now, for example, they have a language network that will address those 15 languages. I do believe, right? And I haven't watch the language network. I don't even know where to get it these days, but it's probably on one of the feeds. So I think that the natural evolution of the network had to grow and address those needs as they move forward. And I think for the most part today, by having that language network, they have. Now with the languages that we have on the network, on the main network, they all come through the Aboriginal envelope, and as you know, there's language requirements within that. To cite them off the top of my head, I think it was 20% had to be within the original language, right? That's how we address those, and we can only deal with the languages that were being presented to us in those languages, right? And that's what we did. So, for the most part, the predominant languages were Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut. Well, if you look at the Inuit people today, and in talking about evolution, there are 3 networks in the north. There's Azuma, Ungavut, and there's another one. Terry, you probably know what it is. Pronounce it, whatever.
The Yuvik network.
But yeah, so they've evolved too. I mean, they've evolved to say, look, APTN is not meeting our needs, right? But we still want a stake in it. And we have a stake in it, which is fine.
Yeah.
But these other people have moved off and created their own networks, which can still trigger that Aboriginal envelope, right? So is that the way things are going to go in the future? I don't know. I know that when I was looking at creating the language network, and again, I got called by Monica Ill and say, Jim, don't try and do a separate one. Work with us. Promise you that it'll be good because we have the feeds. And I know how hard it is to launch a network. So I said, I agree with you, Monica, and I will give you a letter of support. So, the way it works is in the north, they've got 3 networks. In the south, it's going to evolve. I think that, for example, if you have political leadership that is specific to your culture, the Mi'kmaq, would it not speak to if that language is dying or it's losing its effect? Would that not be a catalyst for them to carve their own network out of, right? And be specific to whatever the needs that they need, whether it be education or what have you, right? So that's I think it's probably a good thing that we had a mandate to create all those things which we knew we never could, but it's evolved into something where people can suit it to what they need, right? And it's too bad that other than the Inuit, that the other entities which are too busy fighting for their rights don't see a network as part of that. It's too bad.
Well, this is me, sitting outside it, sitting outside the yeah, that's right. But even back then, sitting outside the programming fray, I mean, I saw the frustration. I can understand the frustration because there were at least 3 different sets of impulses that were shaping the network. One of them was the societies, right, who'd been doing primarily language programming, not focusing on news, but focusing on preservation and reflection of culture. Absolutely valid objective, and they put a lot of time into it, and many, many years of effort, and developed a lot of talent. There was the independent production community, almost completely in the South, active, talented, bursting at the seams with great ideas, and a movement whose time had come, who were working politically on the creation of this new distribution and funding channel, but also creatively, right? Sparked the resurgence of a whole new dimension, a whole new level of creativity and quality in programming. And then there were the licenses. A renaissance, exactly. But there was a third set of priorities, was, the kind of bullshit that you have to say when you're putting in a CRTC proposal. You promise the world, you oversell the network. You just do. Everybody does it. I mean, CPC does it with every license renewal application. Juggling those 3 priorities, Steve, you're describing it as a recipe for disaster. And theoretically, yeah, to me, the miracle of APTN, I don't see it as a recipe for disaster. I see it as a roll of the dice that ended up paying off. Because, Jim, just like you said, what happened? It all evolved. It reflected regional needs, individual needs, funding needs. It was, I still look at the way the network has changed over the last 20 years and I say, this is a freaking triumph that everybody managed to hold it together, that all 3 sets of those requirements, all those 3 different network drives are being met to one degree or another. Everybody is still together, and you've got this I mean, it says it in the PR stuff, and it really is true. This is a major Canadian network and a major player on the broadcast scene. You held it together. They held it together. And because they weren't, the three visions weren't competing. The three visions were trying to collaborate, and it's a kind of a miracle of collaboration to me. Just to your question and speculation, Jim, the notion of what would the Mi'kmaq do now if you were looking at a new opportunity. One thing I really wonder is, and this is a bigger question than maybe we want to get into, or Steve was hoping to get into, but is broadcast television still the network? Or sorry, is broadcast television still the medium to accomplish all of the things that those original goals set out? Because to me, the young producer, I know a lot of the young Inuit producers, they know APTN. APTN is like grandfather, right? It's like CBC. The new networks are exciting and interesting, but there's TikTok, right? Or there's the whole online universe that seems to be their playground now. Back when we were young, you probably don't remember this, but TV and film were the cool places to be, right? I don't know if they. I'm going to speak for the new
Not
generation.
anymore.
Yeah, that's it. So how is that going to impact on APTN? Is that where those kids are going to be going?
Well, eventually they will, and this is why I'll just interject. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
I think they will, because what we really did, and I think this is important, and I think we have to support these entities. We created an envelope that went from I think it was like $1 million to I think today it's 30 million through the CMF and telefilm, right? So whatever through whatever medium they can plug into that and trigger programming for whatever thing they're streaming on at this point, right? And so it is a threat to all the networks, including APTN, that pool is being made smaller because they only have so much money to trigger as well. So that's all evolving, and we have to evolve with it. But at the very least, we did create a bigger fund. We also created the Indigenous Screen Office, which is now becoming a licensing agent with apparently they have Aboriginal people, Indigenous people that know what we're talking about, right? So I know that for example, you could go to the Indigenous Screen Office and get development. You don't need a broadcaster, which is important. So then if you can develop a good idea and then take it to the broadcasters, then you can move forward with that. So I think having APTN is extremely important because of what it brought to the table and caused to evolve.
Yeah, I'm all for having a conversation about the future of it all. My thinking is that I'm with you, Terry. I don't think if you're graduating out of Algonquin College, which is where I went to school. I don't think somebody who's trying to do a documentary is going to go through the trouble of let's explain the process, young man. Here's how you're going to get your film done. You're going to have to develop the idea. You're going to have to pitch it to APTN. You're going to wait for them to tell you whether they're going to approve it or not. Oh, and then you're going to have to build a business plan that's going to include tax credits. Oh, and then you're going to have to wait for a decision to be made. And then once that's done, you're going to go out and shoot it. And you're going to come back, and we're going to take the rights, and we're going to hold them for about 5 years exclusively, thank you, or 3 years. And here's what you're going to get paid for it. I'm sorry.
Pay your bills.
Yeah.
And you're going to pay your bills. I'm sorry, that filmmaker is going to say, what are you talking about? I'm just going to go out there. I'm going to shoot it. I'm going to put it on YouTube. I'll put it on TikTok or whatever, and I'll just do it that way.
Yeah.
And then really at the end of the day, he would still be better off for doing that even if he did that for 12 months and just did chapters of his documentary and put that out there, he'd still be further along with his content being created, at least a couple of chapters of his work, and get it out there quicker than he would with APTN. And look, that's where I'm at. I don't pitch APTN anymore. I don't do that. I'm like, whatever project I want to do, I just go out and shoot it, build a business model around whatever it is I put out there, and try and figure it out that way. And if you can't guarantee yourself that you're going to be in business because on the whims of a broadcaster who may like your show or not, that's a tough way to make a living. You're really it's I can't see that being a sell to somebody's right out of school. You know what I mean? Not with TikTok being there, not with YouTube being there. The entire game has changed in that way. So, when you're looking at the future of it, I would say that each and one of these target areas that we're looking at for in terms of Aboriginal languages, I think you could find all of these languages being broadcast in the TikTok world, in YouTube, and so forth. That's kind of where I'm at. That's the future as I see it. It's going to be a hard sell. I don't know what APTN is going to do in the future to make sure that the young filmmakers going to come to them for financing. Maybe they have their own answers, but I don't want to be in their shoes.
Jim, as an indie, has this changed your approach? Like, are you looking at new strategies for distribution and production in this brave new world kind of thing?
Why did you ask me that, Terry?
Just curious, man. You've got memoirs coming out.
Yeah. No, it's the way I operate now is I'm very streamlined. Sorry, like Steve. I basically do it off the side of my kitchen table, right? Literally everything. So you cut those costs. So it's based on the ideas, and I'm pushing 70, right? And so I know that I'm not going to be doing this much longer, but I think that there's and again, for lack of a better word, there's healing in it in what you do, right? Because even if you don't get that license, at least you're trying to affect change that way. And at the very least, for myself, it's one of the reasons why I do the memoirs, deal with those issues, and by working forward with these ideas that I have, like I'll give you an example, and again, you go to these conferences, television conferences, Banff, the one in Ottawa, Primetime, and you meet producers that want to do Indigenous stories, right? We're in an age of reconciliation, so you say, well, yeah, let's work together and let's see how we can make it happen. Well, I've been working on the Richard Wagame's bio documentary for the last 2.5 years, and I've hit the wall like 3 times at the very least with Telefilm and CMF. But every time, I relook at it and try and think about how you do justice to this, brilliant writer's story. You learn more by working with different people. Like for now, like when we started off, we were working with Jules Gustachin. She's this young up and coming producer. Well, we hit the wall with her because I don't think she really jived with the way I thought the story should go forward. And so I started working with Loretta Todd, who has done Monkey Beach. She's like, if you want to look at a business model, look at what she's doing, and she's not just doing movies and what have you. She's working on animation. She's got this 4-H studio, something like that. It's all about animation and teaching young people. So she's got all these tentacles going with her. But her approach, I said, look, this is the way I wanted to do the story, and I gave it to her, and she says, yes, this is the way it has to be, and gave you input in relation to that, rather than saying, well, here's my fee, pay me, this amount of money, and then I'll get back to you. No, she realizes, because she's from the old school that we come from, this is where it starts, and you may get it done and you may not get it done, but you've learned from the experience, and that goes in the memoir.
Back to the APTN question, Jim, and to the question that Jennifer had presented, is 10 years after the launch of APTN. If somebody here's the thing about APTN, unfortunately, if somebody were to write the next 10 years or the 10 years of its existence from 99 to whatever it was, 10 years, they couldn't do it alone. Because, part of that story is your story. So some part of that's my story. Some part of that is Clarence's story. Who replaced us afterwards would have theirs. So that 10 years is going to have to require the testimony of so many different people, right? So what is your contribution? What is your contribution of your memoirs,
My
what is your
memory.
chapter on APTN going to look like?
Well, I haven't written it yet. Like a lot of my backstory is, my personal life, right? And how that informs everything that I've done with, my journalism career. So I'm basically up to there, and APTN I'm struggling with. Where do you begin? I think that talking about it, like in a forum like this, like some of the things that Dan said, I thought, yes, that's important. And then seeing that we've created careers for people, trying to think. Well, like Jeremy Torrey, all the people that we've licensed in the past, Jennifer Potemski, all of those ones, right? I applaud that, and we have other ones that are coming up that don't even work with APTN, but they're inspired by it, right? So, APTN may not be here in 10 years, but I'll tell you one thing, APTN will have to evolve to make it itself more relevant to all those young people that Terry's speaking about, the other producers that are out there. They're going to have to evolve with the system, and the system is evolving.
Listen, because you're in the opening chapters, or you're just thinking through your chapter on APTN, let's dig into some of the memories, because I think I have some questions that I have for it.
Yeah, sure.
And then, of course, we had this one particular overhanging idea. It was like, be the lost leader. Which of these shows is going to bring in the highest audience rating to attract the possibility of advertising other shows on this network? And I remember we had a couple of ideas on the table. Well, one that we actually orchestrated, and that was Bingo in a Movie, if you remember that.
Yeah.
We had do you remember that?
Yeah.
We had Bingo in a Movie.
That is where that's going in the memoir.
The Bingo in a Movie? Let's help you. I'm helping you. This is just me helping you with your memoir.
Yeah.
You gotta put Bingo in a Movie in the memoirs. There was that one. That was a lost leader that we thought, okay, let's see if we could attract some. And that was complex, by the way. Did we have like a national bingo game going on at the same time? And during each commercial, there would be bingo balls, and Roseanne, Deerchild, and who was was it Rick Hart was the host?
Dave McLeod.
So these were the kind of ideas that we were always trying to come up with in terms of how do we attract an audience to the schedule that was rife with different languages from 1 hour to the next, and so forth. It was a very tough challenge. The second one, if you want to put into your memoir, that I remember correctly and might have got us into some trouble, was the business deal that we orchestrated for Dead Dog Cafe. I don't know if you remember that whole story.
It. Yeah.
So Terry, here's the story on Dead Dog Cafe.
Please.
As we licensed the show, again, we were looking for this lost leader, this one show that was going to bring an audience from beyond the Indigenous communities, something that was a property that was well known by regular Canadians, that if they saw it, to be like, hey, let's go watch that show on that network. Dead Dog Cafe had that cachet. Now, the unfortunate thing is that it was an animation. It was very expensive. The company that we're dealing with, they were at that point a rising star in the animation world, and we licensed it, and we gave them $1 million license, if you remember that, Jim. But the reason we gave them that $1 million license was that we actually had orchestrated a payment system where we were going to be able to finance it over a certain amount of years. So it was like 3 or 4 years in which we were going to have to pay this out, but we would have this 13-part episode animation series based off the show that everybody knew about. That's our lost leader. We're going to lose money here, but it's going to get us back and get us some returns in the end. That show didn't actually it went to the CMF, the Canadian Media Fund, and it didn't get licensed. But what happened was the producers at the time, they came to us and said, look, we'd like to try to continue this project in spite of the fact it didn't get financed by CMF. We'd still like you to pay us your allocated $1 million, and then we will go on and start shooting this thing, or getting to work on this thing. I think that was one of the last big deals that I was involved in, because I kind of left shortly after, because I remember getting a phone call shortly after I left from Thomas King. And Thomas King calls my house and says, hey, what about this show that, that APTN had licensed and promised, and said, and then I actually got a phone call from the lawyer at APTN. What's his name?
Joel
Joel
Fortune.
Fortune.
He calls me and
I
says,
see him all the time. I see
he
him
says,
all the time.
what's going on with this, with Dead Talk Cafe? And I'm like, well, I said, Joel, I said, look, the production company, they promised a series that was going to have a budget of 3.5 mil or so, like that. Our contribution was contingent on them getting the rest of their financing. As soon as they didn't get their financing, the show was done, or in our eyes, we couldn't continue with it. The way we did it, if you remember, Jim, is like we would actually put like 10 shows out. We'd license 10 shows, knowing that a certain number would not get financed. So we were able to kind of.
Well, there was it was based on the envelopes.
Yeah, we knew the. So if they all got financed, it would have been obviously great for us and probably hard for us to figure out how to finance.
Throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
Which is what we said.
Sounds like the producers
which
to
is
me.
what we said.
But I mean, but having said that, they were all really good ideas. So.
Yeah. And so in this case, this show didn't get financed. So they still want their $1 million, and we're like, no, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But I remember that being a very big idea that we thought
they were going to try and sue us, and that's why Joel called, right?
Yeah.
Steve, and I was trying to think of an analogy. Well, here's the analogy with APTN. It was like we were up against like David and Goliath. We were like David going up against Goliath's army, right? And so me, you, Clarence, and I don't know who else was there, but we were fighting this giant. We were at war with this giant, and we did not have the resources or the ways to work around it. So for what we did, I think we should all at least get an eagle feather of recognition, for what we did. I mean, it may not be a medal for that war, but we were in the trenches early on, and what you're talking about, I mean, those were monumental challenges that we faced, and we came up with a strategy to deal with them, and we did. So kudos to us. And even getting phone calls after the fact, that's a testament to our strategy, and I think the fact that it launched a whole network of producers is great. But if so, you asked a question about 10 years later. Well, let's talk about 25 years later and how APTN operates. 25 years later, and I'm not knocking this at all. I think early on, I said, wouldn't it be nice if we had Synergies deals with CBC and CTV and Global and all those guys? Well, don't forget, that was the Goliath that we were going up against, right? They didn't want anything to do with us. They didn't want to do deals with us. Matter of fact, that we worked at odds with them right through. And then there was a pushback from APTN, from the leadership, that said, well, no, we don't want to work with those. We're not doing any deals with those other than the benefits deals that we got, which are, nothing, when you think about it. But if you look at what's on APTN today, and you're talking about lost leaders, well, the biggest lost leader that they have is Little Bird, right? And Little Bird is based on the synergies that we talked about way back when, that we could never do, that are now being affected today. You've got the other show series, Little Crow, not Little Crow.
Yeah, I know the one you mean.
So anyway, these are all synergy deals, right? And that's how they move forward now. We never had that opportunity to. So two things. What it does is it creates an audience for APTN. It creates an audience for if it's Crave, or it was done through Crave, and it was also done through I believe it was CBC with the Crow one. And that's the way it's now working, because APTN does not have the license capability to trigger it on their own, and they're realizing that. And way back when, if we could have done that, we could have done Dead Dog Cafe,
Hmm.
right? But we took a bullet for that. We were wounded on the the field of war, and we were carrying each other back every time we got shot. So that was it. So and then we healed the wounds. Got back out of the trenches and went at it again. So that's the difference. And again, so it does evolve, and I think that the networks, the whole Canadian system realizes that they have to come together because of what's happening with the streaming services coming from the South. Wouldn't it be nice to do a U.S. Canadian production in relation to that? It may never happen, but who knows?
We know you tried.
I tried, yeah, and I think that's where I took the bullet.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, it's just living and learning about these situations.
Well, tell me the story, because I don't know it.
Well, the way it played out was the number one movie that was on the airways at that time was a show called Smoke Signals. Right.
Yeah.
I remember going to the premiere of it, and of course, I know Adam, and I know Evan Adams. I know all, and in Indian country, everybody knows everybody, right? So I knew everybody, and I got to meet the director, who's an American, right? Because this was done under Weinstein's company at the time, Harvey Weinstein's company, Miramax. It was done on a Miramax, and it was the number one movie in the world. And then, of course, Antoine came later. But so we were approached by one of the board members to meet with Chris Eyre to work with him on his next movie, the sophomore movie from this blockbuster movie that told the Indigenous story, which is Smoke Signals. So we met with him. I met with him, and what it was is that we would have an exclusive deal for the Canadian rights to his sophomore movie, which was Skins, and they had a deal. I think it was Miramax to move it forward, but they needed to complete the financing. So we were asked to complete the financing for the deal. So on all levels, it sounded like a good idea. Would give us a little bit of a lost leader, a movie. We could hang our hat on it and everything else. But when the board caught wind of what we did, they decided that I had to leave. And being the good soldier that I am, I just said, okay, well. I'll go back into production. So that's what happened with that one, and was it a good deal? I thought it was at the time. Maybe it was a little rich for small little network, but we took the chance on it. We lost. They hung us by the bootstraps, and that was the end of me. So
I did not know that.
Well. What happened was the movie was not the success that it should have been, right? And because the issues in the States are no different than what we have, trying to get Indigenous productions moving forward, and it's all based on box office. So it was a bomb, right? As opposed to the other one. Having said that, I thought that the performance by Graham Greene in it should have been nominated for an Oscar. It wasn't, but it was a learning lesson there. And the minute that it became public, the board member that brought it to us did not say a word. She let me take the bullet. That document Steve hangs up, I mean, that was a fucking doorstop for us, really.
Hey, buddy,
we tried our best.
My name's on that.
Oh
no.
Well, we erased your name.
Good.
No.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. So you're the author of that. So that moving forward, we could never meet most of those requirements within it, right? And so did the board. So did the advisory board. You know, say, oh yeah, that sounds good. Let's shoot for that.
Yeah, we've got now we have a policy manual. You can tell everybody we have a policy manual. I know. I mean, it's like that all
You
the
got
time.
it, but it's more of a guideline than it was a policy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I hold it up because I just wanted to point out how difficult it was to meet the
Throw it
demands
away.
of the
Throw it
expectations
away.
in it. It was very difficult. But no, I hold on to it.
Send it back to Terry.
Yeah, I may have some edits.
I'm gonna see if these iPods work again.
So
Okay.
one of the challenges that we had is like you basically have this blank slate, and you had the 7 days, and you have all the hours laid out. And what we did was over time was we identified a couple of challenges. One was that okay, we could fill in so for instance, green night would be this particular from 8 to 10 would be just green genre content. So it was if your show had anything to do with nature and so forth, you're more than likely to find that slot between 8 and 10 on the Monday night. If you had a drama, it would be on a 8 to 10 on a Tuesday night. So essentially what we did was we were buying and acquiring content specific slots. You know what I mean? And we understood that if we bought enough years on a particular program, that we could keep that time slot filled and allow us to basically eat up the needs of the license. So that allowed us to buy into bigger, more expensive content in the next year because we knew that our licensing demands were going to be met by an acquisition or something that we licensed in the year before. So we identified a complete color coding scheme for the entire network, and we figured, okay, we bought this program, we have 5 years of this program, we're going to be good for this particular slot. So we were always kind of like figuring out where we stood in terms of the future licensing, in terms of year terms, and in terms of where it fit on the time slot. And that allowed us to kind of say, okay, this is what our schedule looks like. Animation in the morning, afternoon television was that. The Friday evenings were movies, dramas were Tuesday nights, documentaries were Wednesday nights, and so forth and so forth. Essentially a grid, a color-coded grid that allowed us to figure out from one year to the next, what the possibility of that show repeating on the next year, and so forth. And of course, because we have 52 weeks in the calendar year, we were buying 13 episodes. Then we'd run those 13, put another show in its place, and rerun that same 13 in another quarter. So we were always moving the shows around, shuffling the deck really to try and make sure that we were not only meeting in compliance with our CRTC license, but also our own little grid and the strategy we had in our own mind. And we were never trying to double down on a particular genre if we didn't have to. It's like we don't need to invest in science shows if we already had a science show for a particular slot. And that allowed Jim and those of us who were kind of intaking producer proposals to automatically say, we know what you're up against, I'm afraid. We have a sports show and you're up against that sports show, and we have that many seasons of that show, and we have, we don't necessarily need a sports show. Eventually, we kind of determined what we needed and what we didn't need against our CRTC license. That's how I felt we have gotten down to that schedule and that challenge. Down to a science in terms of, okay, this is a good game plan to how to meet the conditions of the license and meet the incoming producers, how to address, because I remember at the time, it was like when producers would come in with a show and they'd be like, we have multiple genres here. Multiple shows of the same genre. How do we select this? And at times it was like, okay, feelings got hurt. I remember at sometimes we identified a particular show that was youth driven, but it was also being produced by a non-Indigenous person. And I remember saying, look, the only reason we're licensing this show this year is because we don't have a competing show of this genre. However, know that next year we expect others to come in and you're not going to get a second license. We knew full well this is a one-time thing for you. You don't have the Indigenous representation, and you just so happens you if you tweaked it at a certain level, we could go with it. So we did. But then the second year would come, and they'd be like, "Hey, I need a second season," and we're like, "No, I thought we were pretty clear that this is a one-time thing." But they were upset because their show had actually garnered some critical acclaim, and it had funding from different sources, and we're like. And yes, it met all of that, and it was a great show for all that, but it didn't have the Indigenous content. It didn't have the Indigenous backing behind it, and we had to let that show. We had to cancel that show. Well, that producer just happened to be somebody I knew well, and they were not particularly happy with me. And I remember Jim actually having to have the conversation with me in the room, and I had to bring the producer in the room, and Jim had to tell the person, "I'm sorry, but this has nothing to do with Steve. This has to do with our schedule and our needs, and I'm the boss. And then I'm sorry, there is no second season for his show." That was the dilemma. It was like, we were faced with a schedule that had to be filled from different languages, genres. We had producers come to the doors with all competing proposals. I thought we did a great job of managing that whole puzzle. And if I were to look at APTN scheduling now, I could see that they didn't adopt that at all. So I don't know how they're licensing programs. I don't know how they're identifying the catalog of different programs they have in specific genres, how they're slotting them, how do they know how many years they have left on any particular show. I don't know how they're doing
one of the things I wanted to mention here was that, okay, in relation to that, right? So, I don't know if it was the policies that we had, and we were constantly bombarded with questions on that. But early on, it was kind of like they expected this and they pushed this, which is fine, but to the point where they would do it through our COO, right? So we had a chief operating officer at the time, right? And he was, I think it was Ron Nadeau, and they were just on him, here's what we want, and you're not getting this to us, and he'd come back to us. So early on in the game, what we decided was, well, maybe we need to take some of that power back, right? So, the board should not have that kind of hard influence on the programming, and I don't know about the news because I wasn't running news. So what happened was when we basically imploded, right? There was questions of money and blah blah, which I don't know where they were coming from, but so what they did is they did the headhunting. They got a new CEO, a COO. But the first thing that they recommended was that the COO have a lot more power to, do what he needs to do to run the organization. So it went from a COO to a CEO, right? Yeah, and we thought, well, that would solve all the problems, but it did, and it didn't, and it didn't in the fact that it now left the CEO to make all the decisions in relations to programming, and there was pressure on that level that was even, I think, I don't know about you, Steve, but for me it was more intense than the pressure we had from the members, right? And so within that, the whole situation just became, for me anyway, untenable. And I thought, the changes that are happening are, I think that, as I said, I decided to put up the flag and go. And then, because you question yourself, you think, well, are what we doing is the way to do it, or this new person, he's gonna get somebody that has more experience. But the reality of it is that we had the experience. We went through that, and I think what we were doing was perfect. And then when they changed it, it was just basically their interpretation, and maybe that's the nature of television, but that's the way it moved forward. And I don't know how it is today, but I think that the mind frame of one person to the next changes the way you move forward. For example, that person would not say, no, we're not doing any synergy deals, whereas the next person says, oh, absolutely, we're going to do synergy deals. And that's the way it is now, which is what we thought would work in the beginning. But yeah, it's evolving. Yeah. So yeah, you could dwell on all the things that cut and bruised us, but end of the day, I think we came out fairly well.
Can I
Yeah.
ask you a
Well,
personal
that
question?
that pressure you talked about. Sorry, go ahead, Terry.
Just Jim, a personal question that I always wondered about. I mean, people who are good at something, who find themselves in an organization, almost inevitably find themselves pulled away from the thing that they love doing, the thing that they do really well, and being put in some kind of management or policy or supervisory position that adds a whole new level of stuff and takes them away from what attracted them there in the very first place. I always thought of you as a producer and a creator, and I'm just wondering that it's a funny shift from that role to the kind of highly systematized organizational tweaking that Steve is describing in terms of setting up the system. Is that where you wanted to be, or was it a relief to get out and get back to? This is for the memoir. This is a whole chapter. Go ahead.
Yes, yeah. No, I'll tell you exactly what I thought. And I think you might know this, Steve or Terry. Sorry, is that when we first started, we all, and all the producers that were there looked at it as, okay, this is going to be a venue for us to move our stories forward as producers, right? But at the time, there was nobody that was willing to put aside their career to actually run the thing, right? And that was offered to me, and not really. I mean, I had to go through the interview and everything else, but it was kind of offered to me that way. That here's where you can help, with your knowledge, right? And I thought, okay, I will put aside the career and move forward with that. I'll give myself, maybe 5 years, right? Well, I lasted 4, right? And I thought, well, and when you're fighting in the trenches like that, and and it gets in here, and you're thinking, like, why am I beating myself up? I mean, I've done everything that I possibly can. I helped launch the network, helped found the network, created what we had in Winnipeg, and moved it to a point where we found out that the board was interfering too much, and we'll get a CEO, and then there were, well, when all those things start exploding in your face, you decide, well, maybe it's time to get out, and that's what I did. Yeah. I did feel that that those years, I thought, all these people that are getting their careers made through our decisions, Steve, and we are being left behind in that, right? And so early on, some of those shows that that were coming through, I said, fuck, these are the stories that I wanted to work with. But anyway,
no, you're right. There is a cost.
We did our time. We did our time. Yeah.
Let's talk about that cost, because let's be honest, we were creating these companies. So you're talking about what is it, Little Dog? What is it? Little Bird?
Little Bird, yeah.
Ernie Webb's company, Resolution Pictures. They when they pitched us in the beginning, they weren't doing drama. They were, I don't know, I can't remember exactly the show that
they pitched us on Real Indians. That was the first one.
And
then of course we had Ernie was connected through the CBC in Montreal. He had that sort of connection. It was kind of a weird thing. Yeah.
But anyway, the point is that we saw them. We were licensing their very first projects for their company, and we knew that essentially what happened was, when you start to do that, I recognized that not only were they were the first to come to APTN, but they were also the first to go to the CMF funds as well, and the tax credit systems. They were learning that system, and what's the name of the Resolution Pictures would have been, they would have been developing. We gave them the opportunity, or APTN gave them the opportunity, to establish their business and a relationship with the CMF, and they were licensed through us. So we knew that from one year to the next, those would have been the companies that were going to be the foundation of Indigenous Southern television, if you will. I think of them. I think of Jennifer Podemski's company at the time was with Laura. She's no longer there. Who else would have been there? Some that we licensed that didn't survive. Brian Francis out east. He didn't. His show didn't. His company didn't survive. But my point is that to Jim's point, if we didn't go to APTN and work at APTN, we would have been the ones producing and pitching to APTN. So we might have been the ones who actually would have had these longer standing companies, because we would have been the ones who would have been the first to go to the CMF as well, right? So that's the way I see it as well. We kind of did sacrifice in some ways. I thought that there were times I think, would I have been better off without going to APTN and maybe had been a company, started a company that in my area would have reached out to a local producer who would have teamed up with me, and maybe that would have changed the direction of my company, or my career. But then that would have deprived me of the opportunity I had at APTN, and there was no way that I would trade that opportunity for that, in spite of the difference.
It was. As they say, it is good and bad, right? So I'll take the good with the bad and move forward on it. Yeah, it was an experience of my life to be a part of that, and I cherish it. I do. When I think back of everything that we've done and where we started from, and it was great. It was great. Yeah.
So. To your point about the pressures that were coming from the north and CEO, that book highlighted a lot of that for me. I didn't realize to the extent of that. You, like I said earlier, I think in some ways, I think you kind of shielded me from a lot of the realities of what you were hearing. I know you were feeling some pressure.
You didn't sit in those back rooms with the members, board members. I mean, it was kind of like, it probably wasn't, but it felt like an inquisition. It was like every time you went in, it was like, oh yeah, it was like a long laundry list of why didn't you do this and what, I think, well, with what we did what we could with what we had, right? So those were the tough times, and then it's history, and I think it's like I said, we should have an eagle feather for the things that we did. So,
look, we're pretty close to the end here, because I think we've gotten almost 3.5 hours here. But I just want to ask a couple of questions about some of the people that have passed since our days there. And Jennifer brought up one that I haven't recalled, and I'm so glad she put it in the book. And that's the passing of Ahasiw. Remember Ahasiw? He worked with Ahasiw worked with Jennifer, and he worked with Deanie there for a while, and I was so glad that she brought him up. I think the way she portrayed him in terms of a visionary, I didn't see it at the time, but as times passed by, and she reminded me of what he was trying to accomplish and what he saw, and I think what he saw was the YouTube influence. I think he did see a world where you're not going to have to go to APTN, and the world's going to live on the internet, because he was so involved in that. And I was so glad that she brought that up, and I want to make sure that his name lived on this podcast. And if we're going to talk about APTN in its early days, she brought him up in the book, and I want to bring it up in this podcast, because I thought so do you remember Ahasiw, Terry?
You know what? I'm embarrassed to say I don't.
That's all right. He was in the Winnipeg office, and he passed because of AIDS, I believe it was, right, Jim? It was.
I don't know why, how, but could be, yeah.
Yeah. So we had a ceremony here in Ottawa in the Gatineau Hills, and we he had his remains cremated, and we spread him out here in the Gatineau Hills. But if Jennifer was here, I'd ask him more questions about Ahasiw and his motivation and what he was trying to accomplish. But I thought he, looking back on it now, he was a bit of a visionary on his own in terms of what he saw and where it was going. And I'd like to have dug in more into that, but I want to make sure we talk about him. And of course, George Henry, I want to make sure that we talk about him. And I thought he was important. And I think if I could say that from what I understand of his vision, I think it, individually speaking, I think we're all faced with the same challenge that he saw, which is that how do you finance yourself individually? How do you separate yourself? How do you make sure that your voice is not lost? And how kind of remain like a bulldog in the sense that don't give up on it. Don't give up on your dreams. Don't give up on what you believe. You're going to get naysayers. Really, that book kind of highlighted for me that really is the spirit that a lot of us are operating underneath at this moment. And that's kind of where we are in terms of the industries. Like there's so many uncertainties of whether APTN is going to be around in the future, whether the funding is going to be available from the CMF. You never know from one year to the next what the fund levels are going to be. So it's a very interesting time in Indigenous media. I'm so glad to have been part of the APTN early years. And, I'm so glad that you guys all took my phone call and said, yeah, sure, I'd love to be part of this conversation. I really am. Yeah. Terry, your parting thoughts on this podcast, and I'd love to have you involved in the future again. I think I'd love to, maybe Jim could talk about what your role was in all this. For me, you were always this one particular, I don't know what you described yourself in terms of a consultant or what your employment was. But I remember you working on this, and it wasn't a doorstop for me. It was an eye opener for me at the beginning. I was more of like this was it did set the ground.
Might as well have been is what I was.
Yeah, I understand perfectly, my friend. I totally do.
Based on the realities that we were facing, for me, Terry was a marvel. I really didn't get to know Terry until I was hired as the program director, and I remember, he had like templates for things, and if we needed to hire somebody, I got it, boom, it was there, boom, it was done, just that support that we needed. Was always there, and your knowledge of the network, the TVNC, and also APTN was phenomenal. And then your team was a good part of it, a major part of it, with Patricia, right? The money lady, right?
Yeah, the money lady,
and working out contracts and everything else. All the little things that we needed, and big things. You worked. I don't know how closely you worked with Patrick Trigney, but you certainly worked close with Abe. And so all the things that we needed to launch a network, it came through you and Patricia, right? Mm-hmm. So we couldn't have done it without you, and I applaud you for that. And I think you're a great man, and I'll give you an eagle feather as well.
Okay. I can't tell you. Wow. Thank you. We were interviewing. Actually, we hired a new manager for a company just before I retired, and he was doing the call around all the employees, getting to know them and asking them the usual sort of motivational orientation questions. So he got to know us a little bit better. And he asked me what it was in my career that I was proudest of. And it didn't take 2 seconds to answer that. The one thing I'm most proud of having been associated with was APTN and the work that we got to do. And probably the best gig I've ever had as a consultant, just in terms of a sense of fulfillment, a sense of welcome, and a sense of accomplishment, which came from you guys and all of the people around me, was the launch and first year of operation of APTN. It was so. You know how depressed Dan can get sometimes about know. We were talking a couple of days ago, and I don't think he realizes, and I hope you guys realize. I mean, who am I to say this? For God's sake, I'm sitting out here watching.
No, go ahead, say it. No.
Just how much difference APTN made and is making to folks who are not producers and folks who are just, television viewers and regular, how much difference APTN has made, what an important organization it is, and what a monumental job you guys who were there right at the very beginning did. There's no bullshit, and I'm not blowing smoke here. When I think back about that, creating this thing that's one of the most impactful, if uncredited, events in recent Indigenous history, I'm serious, that I applaud you all. And working with you is the honor and pleasure of my career. I mean that. So thank you. And Steve, thanks for the opportunity
Thank you,
to revisit it.
Collectively, like Steve, Clarence, Frank Coyle, crazy Frank, Patricia, like that whole office there, we all have to pat ourselves on the back for launching that thing, because I'll leave you with an anecdote. I remember, because we were working feverishly, Steve and the rest of us, trying to get all the files that were sent down from TVNC rejigged so that we could send them back north so we could launch. And I remember working like into the wee hours, and then finally, going out for a beer, and I remember we were walking back to the hotel, because we were staying in the hotel that time. I think I was sharing an apartment with Frank, and his leg locked up, like the stress of it. And he's walking along like Quasimodo, and I remember, and I thought, we just the tension release from that moment, and just we couldn't stop laughing for at least an hour. It was one of those moments where you think about what the fuck did we do, and realize that we did it, and that we were going to get on the plane the next day and head out to APTN to launch the network, right? That'll stick with me. And in relation to Frank, Frank worked up at NCI. He cut his teeth at NCI, so he knew the whole broadcasting system and everything else. And then he worked with me at CBC. So he was my producer. So I trust him, and so he had that knowledge to say, okay, call them up, give them the contract, and we revamped that room in a heartbeat to make sure that everything was ready for the launch, with those tapes being shipped that day on the very same plane that we're on to Yellowknife, launch the network 3-hour special, which was strenuous because of the fireworks, and then turning the TV on the next day to see if we had launched, and there it was. I thought, fuck, we did.
I didn't dream it.
That was a moment. That was a moment. What was running at the time? It was the history of Hawaii, and how the U.S. had taken the land and everything from those Hawaiian people. And I thought, oh my fucking God, those are the stories that we need to tell. Yeah.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. Jim, I think we should do this again. What I recommend, Jim, is we actually get the people that were involved in our department, specifically Clarence.
Anytime you want to do
Cheryl.
It, let's not forget the Terrys and the Patricias, and how's Patrick Drigney? Do we know? Is he still with us?
He had about a cancer, bladder cancer. Recovered from it, was treated, and last time I spoke to him, he was.
I would love to hear his story. Because he was so instrumental in getting, and I can't remember the CRTC commissioner. What was his name? You should know it, Terry.
Was it Chef Franken back then?
No. It was a Portuguese guy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Him. I know who you mean.
between those two, they were instrumental in getting that network from that standpoint through CRTC. Yeah, I'll leave you with one last story because it needs to be told. And I told it, when they asked me to speak at APTN one time, I don't know what it was for something. And the story in my head was the launch, right? And so I remember, we did all this stuff, and then, so I'm standing there with Jerry Garberson. The mobile's here on the top of the hill or the bottom hill, whatever it was, and he the end of the show, and he picks up the phone. He says, "Okay, guys," he says, the credits are rolling, and then all of a sudden the fireworks went off. He goes, "Oh my God, what the hell's going on?" And I thought, it went from it's so smooth, everything went off, and it was just, and then the other thing is, so I'm panicking, I'm looking around, and so run down to where these people are getting the things, and there people are hurdling chairs and everything else, and they're holding up chairs like this, and then Ron Nadeau, being the lawyer, and he was the head of NCI at the time, gets on the mic and says, if anybody's been hurt by this, please come and see me. I'm a lawyer in the back.
I've got cards. Oh.
And then holy fuck, he's covering. I don't know if he was covering NCI's ass or he was. But anyway, I thought, oh my God,
I love it.
The first lawyer on the scene of
and
an accident.
that's how I was walking to my car in the dark, and then getting in, and then trying to sleep that night. And trying to see.
If you've been involved in an accident, please call Ron Nadeau.
Exactly. It was like a commercial. And
I love it.
may not see it.
I love it.
But,
Beautiful. Well, gentlemen, the old saying, leave them laughing, right? So,
all right.
It's been great.
Thanks, guys.
This has been great. Yeah.
This is really good.
Good to see you, Terry.
You know what? I was thinking, how are we going to talk for 4 hours?
You know what, guys? I will endeavor to write the APTN chapter, and I'll send it to you. See what you
Love
think.
to see it.
Okay. Beautiful.
Thanks, friends.
Okay.
Talk to you again.
All right.
Bye.
Okay.
Terry, take care.
Talk to you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.